Welcome to Risk Revolution, a podcast series that examines all aspects of risk management in the life sciences industry. We'll talk to industry experts on best practices for identifying risk, assessing risk, measuring solutions, implementing solutions, and monitoring results. Here are your hosts, Nuala Callan, Valerie Mulholland, and Laurie Richter.
Well, welcome back to Risk Revolution, our monthly series seeking to advance the maturity of risk management practices across the life science sector. We have topics that challenge professionals within the biopharmaceutical and medtech industries, and we aim to shake up the paradigm to revolutionize the way in which we perceive and proactively manage our risk. So welcome back, everyone. We got the band back together, which is great. Summer is over, and certainly here in Ireland, as they say, there's a shortening in the evenings. It's certainly starting to feel like autumn, and we're all back beavering away on our various projects. But Laurie, you were at PDA regulatory conference in Washington at the start of the month. What was everyone talking about?
I was. It was very exciting. First, I'll preface it by saying, and this was very much discussed at the conference, prior to that day of the first day of the conference, it took the FDA they only accepted about 4 weeks prior to that conference to actually attend. So there was a lot of discussion around that. As most people know, the US FDA has had a fair amount of turmoil. Most of the presenters were quite new to us. They were not people that I'm typically used to seeing there. Nonetheless, the presentations were great, lots of data, lots of good conversation, but it was a little bit up in the air, and that was owned at the plenary session at the kickoff of the conference. Attendance was great. It kind of came in a little late, though, because everybody was sort of hanging in there to see. I personally would like to see the conference open up a little bit to outside regulators beyond the US FDA and kind of bring in a lot more. Some people do attend, but I'd like to see more participation and presentations from other health regulators. So there may be opportunity there in the future that they discuss as well. But the big topics were lots of data integrity, lots of AI. Peter Baker was one of the speakers, and those that may not be familiar with Peter, he is ex-FDA, currently a consultant, very well known for data integrity. So he did a great discussion about that and kind of a risk-based approach. Similarly, in line with, I think, what we're going to cover today, Peter had a lot to say about metrics. And he actually said at one point, I wished we could throw them out. So I think lots of great conversation that we'll have today that may align with that. There was lots of discussion around complete response letters. There was actually a whole session about that Sunday night. It was only for invitation only, so I wasn't able to attend that. But for those of us familiar who've been getting complete response letters, they're pretty vast out there right now and mostly associated with CMC issues. The FDA did speak to that, and they said we need to be a lot more thorough when we're putting our submissions in. So lots of good discussion about supply chain, risk management, of course, is always there, life cycle vendor management. So yeah, it was a very exciting full participation conference.
Wow. Well, it sounds like a packed event with lots of hot topics up there for discussion. And of course, like many, I have the utmost respect for Peter Baker. He's a genuine truth teller, and his convictions inform his deep knowledge and insights about what can and often does go wrong, and more importantly, he has a very practical approach to how you can fix it. And so I'm not at all surprised to hear that he's, employing risk techniques in their risk-based approaches. Well, while I'm dying to hear about who you might have up your sleeve for our next invited guest, Laurie, because I know you were working the crowd while you were there, I cannot contain myself with excitement, all caps, about this month's guest, Val. A thought provoker, a disruptor, a truly wise person. Tell us who he is, Val.
Yeah, well, I'll have to agree, Nuala, and admit I sat down with this guest about a week ago and my head is still spinning with questions like, what if all the greens on our dashboard are just good luck? That's one of the topics I explored with this month's guest, Jeremiah Genest, with an interview that actually picked up the thread of intelligent failure from last month's podcast, because Jeremiah argues that quality systems should be designed to fail predictably so that we can learn purposefully.
Yes, so he also takes aim at those feel-good metrics, or what I refer to as those comforts, or that comfort food of metrics, like celebrating 0 deviations. I've always hated that one. All that does is force us to hide things. And so we don't bring them to the forefront to put the proper controls in place. It's provocative, it's practical, and I might never look at a green dashboard again the same.
I know, yeah. And turning risk management into real science with something he calls falsifiable hypotheses. I have to get my teeth done, I think. Anyway, I sat down with Jeremiah to unpack all of this. So let me give you some background on Jeremiah before we listen to the interview. He'd previously worked in quality roles in Takeda, Sanofi, Thermo Fisher, Vertex, Amylyx, and he's currently the Senior Director of Quality Technical and Risk Support, QTR, I think is the acronym for that, at a company called Just Evotec Biologics. It's a CDMO for next-gen biologics, antibodies, biosimilar products. And there he oversees some of our favorite areas: risk management, data integrity, quality strategies for FUSE, that's facilities, utilities, systems and equipment. And he does this for both the clinical and commercial operations. He is also a very enthusiastic volunteer with ASQ, the American Society for Quality, nonprofit community for quality professionals in the US. And with them, he's chaired the Team and Workplace Excellence Forum. But how I know Jeremiah is through his blog. He authors an extremely thought-provoking blog which explores, advocates, challenges, and scientifically questions many aspects of quality management. His passion for topics such as validation, change management, knowledge management, risk management, quality culture, data integrity, the future of quality, they're all evident and covered in this blog. And I'm certainly a subscriber, an avid reader of all his insightful musings. So we decided to bring him onto the pod and listen to some of his thoughts. And I started by asking him about the blog and its very strange name. Jeremiah, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast because I'm an avid reader of your blog, which has the very unusual title of Investigations of a Dog. Can you tell us the story behind the title? Maybe why you blog, what you blog about, and off you go.
Yeah, thank you, Val. First of all, I'm excited to be here. I also am a longtime listener of the blog of the podcast, and a reader of your writings. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So when I wrote my blog, I chose the name based on one of my favorite Franz Kafka stories. It's about this dog who is exploring the world from a dog's perspective, right? So this story, Investigation of the Dog, is about a relentless, almost obsessive curiosity, the need to uncover hidden truths and root causes. And that matches my work in quality and compliance. Well, all of ours, right? We mirror the dog exploring his elusive nature of the world. And Kafka is like one of my favorite writers because I think his explorations of bureaucracy, of ambiguity, the search of meaning, they resonate with me as a quality professional. He's one of those anchor stone writers as we navigate this complex systems, unresolved questions, sometimes illogical regulatory expectations that I think all of us should read. If I could, I would actually assign that to new hire employees with, the Q Trio and 21 CFR and UDRLAX Volume 4. So by invoking Kafka, I'm trying to emphasize the need for critical thinking, persistent inquiry, and willingness to challenge surface explanations, the things that are important to me as a quality professional, and the things that I want to help build in our profession.
Well, I'm smiling at your approach for new hires, but Kafka's writing does famously intertwine philosophy and realism, and I have a feeling some of our conversation today might feel a little like that. But maybe that's the nature of critical thinking, perhaps.
Yeah.
Anyway,
one
of you. Go ahead.
I think as a quality professional, we tend to get very focused on the technical nature of our profession and forget equally that critical thinking is about how we examine the world and how we approach it. And literature is equally a source to that.
That is so true. That is so true. Yeah. So, to come to some of your musings and writings, I think one of your recurring blog points, as I see it, is that current quality management and quality risk management often feels like unfalsifiable science, to use your language. That is to say, if nothing goes wrong, we assume our systems must be good, which, to misquote Kafka, might be sleepwalking us into an illusion there. You write about, speaking of illusions, you write about the sampling illusion, that 0 deviations in 1,000 units isn't necessarily proof of capability. It might just be proof of your limits of measurement. I love your line about management review. I think you said, we cheer 0 deviations, but secretly wonder if we're just lucky. I create such an imagery in my head. But, to come to the point, if we can't prove our quality system wrong, how can we prove it right? So how widespread do you think that quiet little doubt is, and how important is it to talk about it?
Yeah. I think it's incredibly widespread and is in just about every organization. We just don't talk about this, right? And you just have to look at the white papers that have written about very high performing organizations that go into consent decree. Earlier on in my career, I had the fortunate to join Genzyme after it went under consent decree and work on that team. And one of the things you got from everyone is, well, things were going so well. There weren't any problems. Our deviation rates were good. But that was just hiding the huge unknowables. And there were, of course, many things wrong. There's a reason why Genzyme went under a consent decree. But in every one of our organization, that feeling that you're green here, but then 2 weeks later, there's a huge problem. And leadership looks at you and goes, how did this happen? We were green. So we're all wrestling with this feeling of, are we just lucky or are we actually good? But we don't necessarily have in place the mechanisms to truly challenge ourselves, right? Because that requires proving a negative. Lucky for us, the scientific method exists. So testing theories, right? Instead of celebrating how 0 deviations mean we're in control, we really need to start asking ourselves, what are the conditions that drive quality, right? What's the experiment that can prove us wrong? And that's the difference between hoping our systems work and actually knowing why they work. It put out the quote, which I had about 0 findings, often meaning we weren't looking hard enough, right? That's statistics. That's going back to the work of Schuhart, the work of Deming, which is a foundation point, right? Where our measurement systems have limits. This is one of the reasons why I personally often look at people who want to bring in too much of Six Sigma or even too much of Lean, because you got to realize that they're based on different statistical models. They're the ones that you often have in our industry, especially as you get into a lot of the specialty molecules, the large molecules, right? Biologics just don't work this way.
No.
So real control means designing monitoring that can actually catch problems, not just confirm what we hope is true. And to do that, we have to embrace the science, right? And the industry's fear of admitting uncertainty keeps us stuck with theatrical compliance instead of actual improvement. The funny thing for me, and your podcast, you're always saying this, right? ICHQ9 is science-based, right? Science-based risk management. Well, this is what science-based risk management means. Systems that are robust enough to fail predictably when our assumptions are wrong, not systems where we can't understand what's truly going on in them. So, and I think this approach applies to everything we do. It applies just as much to human-centered processes as it applies to the technology. I think on my blog, I recently wrote about a warning letter about a capo where they use masks in grade C, right? That was their instant thing. Oh, we have contaminations in our grade C, let's use masks. Instead, they should have defined a hypothesis. For example, talking about during critical operations increases environmental bioburden within a 3-foot radius by detectable amounts. That's something you could prove or disapprove. Too often in our root cause analysis, too much in our problem solving, too much in our design, we leap to a tried and true conclusion. We have contamination, we must fix our gowning. Instead of saying what's really going on in our environment and how do we fix it? What's really going on within our bioreactor and how do we plan for that shifted pH and dissolved oxygen leading to a change in viable cell density, right? Again and again and again, we need to find how to prove it, how to make it falsifiable, sorry.
Mm, mm. Do you know, as an Irish woman, now that imagery of green on a dashboard or on a risk assessment or even on a process HMI, perhaps meaning luck rather than control, that's going to
Yeah.
stick with me. But it does make you wonder if, in fact, we are managing quality or maybe just the appearance of quality. So let's double click on some of the thoughts there that you've proposed. For example, you argue for something called hypothesis-driven validation. Now, that's a scientific but non-traditional concept, and it could be a powerful shift in approach. Can you explain what you mean and walk us through what that looks like in practice compared to that traditional meets the spec and test the worst case mindset?
Yeah. So let's stick with that example of gowning that I just brought up. I think it's a good place to go, right? So
Relatable.
our traditional approach when we're doing EMPQs, when we're setting up our contamination control strategy, is proving personnel don't contaminate, right? We're gonna enter in and we set up, okay, we're gonna monitor personnel by taking glove and gown samples, right? Hopefully we've read Annex 1, right? And so we celebrate when we get 0 recoveries. And we say, hey, we did our sampling on gowns, we did our sampling on the gloves, our personnel have great gowning, it's working, our personnel aren't contaminating the environment. But that's just proving you didn't find contamination that time, that you're hyper aware situation as you're going through EMPQ. Hey, everyone, we're in dynamic EMPQ. Hey, everyone, it's time for your yearly requalification. Just proves that is working. It doesn't, it doesn't prove that your gowning is going to work in the worst of times and the best of times. It just said it worked during EMPQ, right? And it doesn't show that you don't really have contamination. And then when you get the hit, excuse me, when you get the hit, everyone's surprised that, whoa, where'd this trend come from? What do you mean we have mold in that room? So, right, think of where the sampling illusion is in action here. It's in your contact plate, right? A typical contact plate on a glove after aseptic operations might detect contamination only if there are greater than 10 CFU. But we all know that the personnel is probably shedding organisms at a lower level, right? So if they're shedding a 1 to 5 CFUs, excuse me, there's a good chance that's not going to be discovered. So that's 0 results. That's on the method. That's on the way we're doing sampling, not on the absence of shedding. So let's build a falsifiable approach into our EMPQ. And we're going to test behavioral theories. So instead of trying to prove that personnel don't contaminate, we're going to develop a testable theory about what drives that contamination. So one theory that comes to mind, right, is rapid arm movements during material transfer increase particle generation by 3 to 5 times compared to deliberate slow movements. Or another theory, personnel contamination correlates with time spent in the suite. Shedding increases exponentially after 2 hours of continuous work. Number 3, talking during critical operations increases environmental bioburden within a 3-foot radius by detectable amounts. I can prove through experiments each one of these, right? I can bring in my real-time particle counters to measure particle generation during different movement patterns. I can correlate the environmental monitoring results with personnel work duration and behavior patterns. I can test environmental samples at different distances from personnel during talking versus silent operations. So in my organization, when we did this, when we tested, for example, talking during operations, we discovered that normal conversations during operations increased recoverable bioburden in settle plates by like 200 to 400% within a
Wow.
1 meter radius. Now I'm not theoretical. It's measurable, it's reproducible, and it challenges the assumptions of proper gowning fixes things. They're proper gowned, but it's talking. And so instead of celebrating zero recoveries during the MPQ and assuming success, we developed active, tested, specific theories about the way people were behaving, about the environmental impact, and that led to evidence-based procedural improvement rather than just compliance theater. And we could do that in every area that's important to us in our organization.
So if I'm understanding you right, what I hear in your argument is that we could in reality double click on the risk assessment and the hypothetical causation of risk, the chain of events, which there's always a chain of events that lead to these hazardous situations, and then by challenging them in the validation process, perhaps reveal some genuine process understanding and risk knowledge, I think,
That's exactly what I'm striving for. People
Wow.
understanding, right? We stop with our risk assessments and they become compliance exercises.
Yes.
I had a leader say to me the other week, well, we just need to do a paper exercise risk assessment, and then that will prove whether we can move forward or not. And I just sat there silently, counted to about 30. And then he said, but we need to test something. And I said, yes. Right?
Yeah.
Because that's building the understanding that on paper it may look good, but until you challenge it, until you actually find what's really going on, that's just a paper exercise. And it's the first step, right? That conference room exercise, but it's not the end point.
Yeah, so we could move from piling the paperwork to piling the process understanding, if you like. You've actually laid out a 5-phase approach. I mean, you're quite structured in your thinking here, from hypothesis to adaptation. And it sounds to me almost like a scientific method we could apply to QRM. Can you walk us through that and an example in real life, perhaps?
It's 100% the scientific method. I think, as I said before, it's the regulators have been really clear to us. Risk management is science. I think we all get confused when they say that sometimes, and we start thinking it's science-based, means that we should draw in the science, that we should go make sure our scientists are in the room. And yes, we should. But I think it's also as important to think of it as it's just the scientific method. We're applying the scientific method. That's, the funny thing is that Deming was yelling about that back in the 80s. And it's and we can go back even earlier, right? That's long been our biggest challenge in our organization is how do we scientifically approach quality? So as you said, I lay out 5 phases. And I'm an example-driven person. It's probably because I've developed too much training over my career. And so let's use a different example. Let's choose viral clearance, another fun one, right?
Okay.
Traditionally, viral clearance, we basically do the same thing every single time. We test our worst case conditions, we get our 4-log reduction, we check the box, it's validated. But we're not learning anything about that. We're just saying, well, this thing that worked last time works this time. I have a 4-log. It's great. Well, that's a sloppy approach to ICHQ5. It's a sloppy approach to viral clearance. It's only as good until it's not good. So right? The first phase is hypothesis development. Right. Hypothesis development, this is what we're doing when we're in the midst of our risk assessment, right? We're going from hazard identification through risk identification and evaluation, right? This is what we're doing. We're thinking of a hypothesis. So we're making those predictable predictions. So instead of just saying, we don't reach a 4-log viral reduction, right? Our hazard is viral contamination, failure, because we don't have a 4-log reduction. We say, what are specific predictions? Like viral kill follows first order kinetics with a temperature coefficient of 2.5, right? That's a great conversation. And normally when my process development partner goes off on that end, I reach a point where I'm like, okay, I trust you. But that's something that we can prove wrong. So we enter into phase 2, experimental design, right? We design a study that can falsify that hypothesis, not just confirm compliance, right? So instead of just we run our process, we get 4-log reduction, life is good. We test out our hypothesis. So we test at multiple temperatures and time points to see if our kinetic model actually holds up, rather than just that 4-log reduction, right? Oh, hey. Or rather than, the next step is we just do worst case. Okay, our pH needs to be at this, our temperature, we just test out our ranges. Nope, we're doing our kinetic study. And through this evidence collection, phase 3, it's always about going to the evidence. We can collect that data systematically to test our theories. So when we measured viral kill at different temperatures, we're not just checking boxes. We're testing whether our hypothesis, our temperature coefficient prediction, was right or wrong. Now we're in phase 4, hypothesis evaluation. So, hey, maybe we were wrong. We got to be willing to admit we're wrong. Willing to admit we're wrong is one of the hallmarks of a quality professional. So our temperature hypothesis was falsified. The actual coefficient was not 2.5. It's like 3.2, right, in our product. So which told us temperature control was more critical than we originally thought, right? We thought we had a lot of allowance on temperature. But instead, through falsifying it, we find out it's very, very specific. So now, phase 5, system adaptation. We use what we learned to improve the actual process because temperature is more sensitive than predicted. We tightened our control specs. We enhanced monitoring, right? Those are real mitigations, real controls, real improvements based on the science, not just on, well, we have to make sure we control pH. We have to make sure we control temperature. We instead really understood what we had to control there. And those are the 5 phases. And yeah, it's the scientific method. I'm just applying it through practice into the risk management space rigorously.
So by starting by framing your risk question as a scientific hypothesis that you're exploring, and then progressing through the phases, doggedly as a scientific approach, it does sound to me like there might be more in-depth learning for sure from that approach. But Jeremiah, some might argue that this work should be done in R&D and that it's okay to present a commercial operation, a manufacturing site with the spec and, driving that traditional validation approach. Where does all this live?
Yeah. So the quality by design methodology, which is set out in the Q trio, right, starting with Q8, and then has been built on, really establish the methodology where, yes, it starts with R&D, you build your experiments, and then you progress them through manufacturing. This is why we have small scale models, and then we have large scale testing. So in the case of temperature, where I was talking about it, that is very doable in the small scale model. I'm going to do those experiments in my small scale model. But once I have the provable controls, I'm going to prove that those controls work in operating conditions. And that's critical here. We have to remember that our small scale models, the work that our process development people do, is going to build the science, but is never going to capture operational reality. It's never going to capture at scale on the manufacturing floor at 3 a.m. with people who are really looking forward to a week of vacation.
Mm.
And that's the testing we have to do, right? And that's the demand that's there. We just have to look at where the regulators are coming from to understand this is really close to what they want, if not exactly what they want. I was just reading last week the new draft chapter 1 of chapter 1, volume 4 of the UDRALAX, right, of the GMPs, which was rewritten to basically say risk management, risk management, risk management. And that's laying out this approach as well, that yes, you develop the science, but you've got to challenge the science.
Yeah.
That's the purpose of validation, to challenge the science. That's the purpose of an EMPQ, to challenge microbiology. And risk management is as much about the people operating as it is the way your molecule behaves.
Yeah, and we're not Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz saying it 3 times isn't going to make it so. Can I change rails slightly here
Sure.
and lean into your passion for teams and workplace excellence? And because regular listeners to our podcast will recall our book club episode last month where we discussed Amy Edmondson's book, The Right Kind of Wrong, and how important it is to learn from failure. And I know you're a fan as well. One of the biggest hurdles to what you're proposing seems cultural, embracing
Yes.
failure as learning. How do you get leadership teams to move from, risk avoidance and I mean that in every sense of that word, not even entertaining the thought of it, to embracing controlled failure as learning and more importantly, this sounds a small bit on the verge of experimentation. I mean, how much of our quality budget can we assign to genuine learning versus ticking the boxes on our compliance documents?
Yeah, that's a struggle.
That's a big question.
That's a huge question. So I am a huge fan of Professor Edmondson. I think that she's one of the current must-reads. And I would also encourage all your readers, if they didn't go off and read The Right Kind of Wrong after your book club podcast, to please do so. Because she talks about how leadership has to model intelligent failure first, right? You can't ask teams to embrace controlled failure when leadership is still punishing any deviation from plan. One of the most powerful things that happened when I joined my current organization back in the beginning of 2024 is I was in a conference room with my counterpart in operations. And he was talking to a lot of frontline workers. And he started the conversation about his biggest failures in his career, right? And he took ownership of how he had made a decision that had led to several batches having to be discarded, right? And then he drilled that in again and again and again through conversations that I saw in my early time with him, and he continues this of sharing the things that didn't work and what he found valuable. That's the behavior we all need to show, right? We all need to start by sharing your own intelligent failures publicly. There are experiments that didn't work but taught you something valuable. Now, you just can't do that. You just can't say, hey, I led to this problem and whoops, that was funny, and laugh at it, right? It's about building that storytelling capability. One of the core skills of a leader is storytelling. And we don't hire, promote, and train people for that. And we really need to. We need to make storytelling as important to leadership, as important to the quality profession, and of course to operations people as any other aspect, right? And part of this is being able to distinguish between preventable failures and learning failures. Because not all failures are created equally. Again, getting back to Edmondson's work, basic failures like misdocumentation, procedural lapsing, things that should be prevented, those aren't very valuable. Those are actually, you just fix them, you move on. It's the intelligent failures, right? These are the ones that allow us to test new hypotheses, that challenge assumptions. These should be celebrated. We, quite honestly, punish both equally. We treat them the same. And so we as an organization want to be able to learn, right? Which is all about what psychological safety is. So we got to build that psychological safety. We got to actively build the skills. We've got to inoculate this into our leadership so that they can then bring it to the organization. And it needs to be something we hold our leaders accountable to. It's got to be part of their core value to the organization, which means that's what they got to be compensated to. And that's the harder conversation. I wish I could solve that one. Because that gets into that budget question you asked.
Yeah.
Right? In our organizations, we probably, I mean, if we're lucky, if we're a mature organization, we're about 80% compliance, 20% on learning. We've got to adjust that. And unfortunately, what happens at an organization is you can't stop doing the compliance things. They're bare minimum. So it's that challenging yourself so that you can rebalance it, figure out the ways of doing it, move beyond the compliance theater into real scientific inquiry. So to do that, we have to allow controlled experiments. We have to have a process in place so we can have safe to fail zones so that you can test hypotheses. Process characterization is supposed to be the space, getting back to your thoughts about R&D. But let's be honest, we often rush or we seal it off. Defeats the whole purpose of quality by design, right? So we have to ensure that process characterization is truly our safe space. It's not a check the box activity. It's not the thing we do at the last minute and we're rushing just to prove things. We have to build spaces to test new ideas, and we have to be willing to do that throughout the organization. One of the easiest places to start is to change our quality metrics. We started this conversation with that green circle at QMR, and we're all so happy, but what does it actually mean? Stop celebrating zero deviations. Stop actually tracking things like how many deviations were open this month. What does that tell you? It actually probably drives the wrong behavior. Track hypothesis testing completed. Track assumptions challenged. Track process improvements. Even track things we learn from failed experiments. When you measure learning as rigorously as you measure check the box compliance, that behavior will follow. And that's a powerful place that we as a quality leader can change. I'm not going to say easily, but that's where we have power. We control the QMR. And so we can start tracking things that are more valuable. Build in real metrics instead of the check the box and use that as part of the conversation with our fellow leaders and build the right behaviors from it.
Now, I'm imagining some of our listeners driving home from work, listening to our podcast, having little panic attacks because they're steeped in this current, compliance-focused approach. And, I guess this concept of positioning falsifiability, we'll say, as a maturity level beyond compliance approaches. Like some people would worry regulators might see that in itself as risky. So how do you explain that, this scientific approach, this concept of scientific curiosity, of framing risk as a hypothesis, of falsifiable risk management, how do you explain that actually strengthens patient safety? And I'll add a part two there because, I know many of our listeners are US based and are familiar with the conversation with the FDA about quality management maturity. You mentioned it there briefly. How does that line up with that vision?
Oh, I love quality management maturity, QMM. So first of all, as I've already said, this is what scientific based means. So the challenge that we as an organization is how do we adapt to this? How do we leap in enthusiastically and develop it, right? So that we're developing new tools to assess safety and quality, right? So we're building falsifiable, those testable theories into it. That's what drives quality outcomes, right? Not compliance theater, not doing things that can never be proven wrong. ISO 31000, Principle 6, the writings that came out of the working group for ICHQ9R1, the what we're seeing now in the new Volume 1 and Volume 4 drafts and the new Annex 11 and the crazy new Annex 22 for AI all shows us that regulators are at this point. So we as an organization, we need to say, okay, how are we going to meet them there? Right? How are we going to build this into our systems, get rid of the blind spots that can't distinguish between our systems working and just being lucky, right? I think you'll find the regulators very enthusiastic about this. I think you will have a lot of the key thinkers saying, yeah, that's pretty much what we've been saying. Maybe they don't, haven't latched onto the same terminology as me, but we're still figuring this all out, right? And we see this in the quality management maturity that the FDA did and all the St. Gallen reports that are sort of the bedrock to this approach, right? That really informs a lot of the theory. The QMM's top level is optimized systems that use qualitative feedback and continuous improvement driven by data. Well, qualitative feedback, continuous improvement driven by data, that's falsifiable quality management. That's what we're talking about here. Systems that make predictions, test them, learn from the failures, and adapt based on evidence rather than assumptions. So by moving beyond the compliance minimums, a low maturity score, to falsifiable data, that's going to be competitive. That is what is going to prevent the 483s, the compliance findings, the warning letters of the future. And the FDA is recognizing it, the PICS is recognizing, EMEA, everyone is recognizing that companies stuck at basic compliance create supply chain risks and drug shortages. Companies that are looking for falsifiable approaches are going to be the ones who are at that higher level of maturity and then can reap the benefits of regulatory flexibility, reduced inspection frequency, and let's be honest, enhanced business reputation. I certainly wouldn't want to have some of the ProPublica investigative research that they've been publishing recently about the pharma supply chain written about one of the companies I work for. Right. And so this cultural shift from risk avoidance to intelligence failure to mature quality systems, as the FDA describes them, promotes a proactive detection of vulnerabilities. That's in their QMM document. Promote proactive detection of vulnerabilities, foster a culture that rewards improvements. These aren't my words. These are the FDA's. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Systems designed to fail instructively when assumptions are wrong, rather than defensive systems designed to never admit that they might be wrong. So when people are like, we just have to meet bare minimums, my point is, but that's not what we're being challenged to do. If I wanted to meet bare minimums, I might want to be in a different field. Because at the end of the day, it's all about patient safety.
It is, yeah. Do you know, Jeremiah, it's such a privilege to be on this blog or on this podcast and interview people like yourself that are thought provocateurs and disruptors, and just expand all our minds in terms of that there are many approaches, and some of them are very scientific. So I will be encouraging our listeners to read your blog. I find it fascinating. And of course, Amy Edmondson and Deming, which we're big fans of on the pod as well. And now Kafka.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, so first of all, Deming, I think, is unrealized. I've actually written about this several times on my podcast. Is that his his system of profound knowledge, his 14 points. Oh, I don't think we've realized that. And they've been around for 40 years.
I haven't updated.
I mean, I wish I could completely drive fear out of the organization. So I think we can still learn a lot from Deming.
I think so too. So listen, thank you very much. But let me ask you one final question. If you could spark one risk revolution in the industry and how it thinks about quality, what would that be?
Oh, well, end our addiction to unfalsifiable comfort metrics, right? End our addiction to metrics that celebrate the absence of problems rather than the presence of understanding, right? Abandon quality systems around proving negatives. Stop celebrating zero deviations. Stop celebrating, well, I mean, I like audit readiness, but don't use, I always find that metric to be a really weird one. Build falsifiable systems that make testable predictions, right? So it's not just methodological, of course. It's about the culture moving from defensive risk avoidance to intelligent failure as a learning tool, where risk management is driving how you as an organization are learning, how we design our quality systems so they're robust enough to fail predictably when our assumptions are wrong. So if we can adopt this as we move forward to this, we're transforming quality from compliance theater into a genuine use of science. And that's where maturity is going to come from. That's going to drive cumulative knowledge generation about what works, and not just hoping nothing is wrong. So yeah, the thing I'm hoping for is let's move beyond the comfort metrics. Let's really challenge ourselves.
Well, with that thought, thanks very much, Jeremiah, for joining me today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, lots to think about and reflect on there. Oh my goodness, Val, what an interview! Thank you so much for that. It was truly inspirational. I loved his insistence that we can't prove that our quality systems can pick up and signal when things go wrong. And can we really claim that it's in control if we can't prove that just because we're getting those zero defects? And as you say, is it good luck or good design and good controls? Of course, that flips a lot of our current paradigms and metrics on their head. Thanks also for that nice shout out from him on the metrics research that I've been involved in with my colleagues at St. Gallen. So it was nice to see that he's obviously he's very well informed of what's going on. What a great set of examples on how to develop leading metrics, to get away from those comfort food ones you mentioned, Laurie. I loved the ones where he says, how about we start measuring how many hypothesis tests we've completed this month, or we track how many assumptions we've challenged this month, or we track process improvements. And for me, my personal failure was, how do we track things we've learned from failed experiments? I love that. Learning from failure. I mean, this is what it's all about. And again, back to, as you mentioned, Professor Amy Edmondson and the right kind of wrong. Well, the whole lot of it was just so much common sense. His determination that validation should be about challenging the science just really resonated for me, where he said, we should be asking, what are the experiments that can prove our systems can go wrong? Obviously what he refers to as that hypothesis-driven validation. And I loved when he said, it's the difference between hoping our systems work and actually knowing why they work. I love that. And I mean, how many of us have sat through, and been party to large scale validation projects where largely they're driven by confirmation bias. We're testing this, that we're within specification, as opposed to really challenging what happens when the process goes wrong. I also love the concept, we talk about these risk and science-based approaches and, this concept of challenging the science. He really talks about practicing the risk science, the science of risk management. So not just using the product or process science that's there as evidence, to support our risk-based decision making or justify our rationales, but that the real control, and of course, the whole process of risk management is about designing risk control strategies that are fit for intended use. It's not about documenting or doing risk assessments. It's about designing the risk controls. So where he talks about that the real control is in designing monitoring systems that catch real problems, not just confirm what we hope to be true. So I just absolutely loved it. Every bit of it. I could have listened to him all evening. So what do you think, Laurie?
Yeah, same. So I appreciated the zero recoveries during EMPQ, where that everyone's just standing there absolutely paralyzed, so that they can pass that. So they don't want to shed, versus challenging our movements, the talking near operations, minimal things like that do happen that we're not always challenging. I really loved how he kept talking about this compliance theater. I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I love that because that's what those kinds of things are. It's sort of like the metal detector versus actually doing something to prevent the weapon from possibly entering the facility. Those are sort of theater, right? So that we feel comfortable, we feel good, no deviations, we feel better. There must be no problems. I think he had sort of this common theme going. Too often we reward the absence of a signal like, great, no findings, everything's green, we're good, instead of asking the questions, why is it green? Are we testing the right things? Can we get this to actually fail? And would we learn from it if it did? Because if we measure for learning, we'll actually get learning.
Yeah, and it mirrors what good science looks like. Start with a testable prediction, design the study to falsify it, gather evidence, adjust the model, adapt the system. That's what his 5 phases were about. It's Deming. It's QBD. It's QRM with teeth. Yeah, perhaps we should use small scale work to map the science and then challenge it in operational reality, like at 3 a.m. with the real shift people in real conditions with real variability, because I think that is where the risk lives, and maybe that's where validation should learn.
Yeah, and it also squares with the direction of travel where the regulators are going at the moment. In terms of their science based risk management, the maturity models that we're seeing being talked about that reward proactive detection and prevention and those learning loops, not just that checkbox compliance. So the regulators are calling this out as well in their policy. Now, even though the language varies, I think the intent is very consistent right across everything that we've seen recently. Whether it's the recent regulatory publications that Jeremiah mentions, the update to Chapter 1 of the EU GMPs on the pharmaceutical quality system and the level of embedding, based on the ICHQ 901 updates around risk management, around knowledge management, that language working its way in there. Of course, the Annex 1 update and the development of risk-based, contamination control strategies and how we're going to demonstrate the effectiveness of those. And even the most recent QMM publication, the Quality Management Maturity publication from FDA that came out during the summer at the end of July, which has the unusual subtitle you wouldn't expect to see from a regulatory publication of an economic perspective on quality management maturity. Very much in line with our good friend and earlier guest on the pod, Anders Vintner, and his QBL program, which, focuses on supporting quality leaders to use their influence to leverage, the value of quality as opposed to the cost or indeed even burden of quality, and how this can become, a business capability. So it was very much in line with that, and a huge amount of common sense there, and of course, lots and lots about Deming, who we love on this pod.
Yeah. So I wanted to just jump in a little bit about Jeremiah's mention regarding Deming. And I think he even made the statement, and correct me if I'm wrong, Val, it was something to the effect of, we're not doing most of these things. and and he was correct, because I had to go back and look at all those 14 points again and kind of dig into them a little bit during the time I was listening to that podcast. And a few that came to mind that really spoke to what Jeremiah was getting at was some of Deming's focuses were eliminating these quotas, putting these numbers on things, eliminating management by numbers or numerical goals, removing barriers that rob the hourly worker of their right to pride of workmanship, same for the supervisor and management. Because Deming believed that those kinds of metrics and measurements and those quantitative approaches put pressure on people to shortcut, to produce at all cost, to just keep moving forward, and quality wasn't always considered. So I think that is something, when you think about our metrics and how we measure them today, it's how many discrepancies have we generated, or how many days did we have it open, or how many CAPAs have we kicked off. Those are the things. We're still sort of stuck in that widget kind of approach, because I think it's what we know, and it's a little bit easier to measure. It's maybe not as difficult. We just sort of go to it. So that one really spoke to me when I went back and looked at that. We really should focus more on building systems where good results are the natural outcome, where you're looking at the people working in the process and making the process more effective and efficient for the person, and then they can take pride in that workmanship. I think we've sort of taken that away too, because we're just pushing harder, make more of this stuff. So for me, I think he was pretty spot on about where we're at. And when you think about the history of the US and why Deming was over in Japan and he was teaching those concepts, Japan picked up on those at the time around World War II. They actually ran with that, and they took over the US automaker at that time. And the US automaker was still sort of standing there going, what happened? Because they didn't adopt Deming's principles. So I think it's something we need to look at today. When we have history, we have information that happened in the past and how that changed things and improved the systems. Why aren't we looking at that today? Why did we drop all that? And why do we still continue to abandon it and still talk about it? So I was really excited. I think when we look at our QMRs, there's lots, or QSMR, whatever you refer to it as, I think there's lots of opportunity there with mindset, with behaviors, measurements around that. With the hypotheses that are tested. I loved that concept. That was neat. I think we need to move more towards learning opportunities, innovation, and development when we're thinking about those measurements.
Yeah, I second that. So, me and my Monday morning, what can we do? I took away 3 thoughts that I would say are a call to action. First was to supplement our metrics of how many deviations we closed this month. Actually, I was going to say scrap that metric, but I'm not. I'm going to keep the ambitions realistic. Supplement that metric. With how many learnings did we have this month instead of how many deviations did we close? Second one, narrate intelligent failure. It's funny how that storytelling came up again,
Yeah.
Kick off meetings with a short, what failed, what did we learn from it story, and make that, a routine event. And my third learning was design one falsifiable test. It could be something simple like a human factor, movement or speed or talking or not talking, your critical operations or, checks that we do. It can be quite simple. Predict the effect, measure it, and adapt the step if need be, So listen, a huge thanks to Jeremiah. I think he challenged us all with his Kafka and Deming and Amy Edmondson and all. So and just to say to listeners, if you do try a falsifiable test on your site, tell us about it. Tell us what you learned, because we'd love some real world stories here and feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're ready to maybe adopt Jeremiah as one of our close family members. We loved it so much. Not to mention the fact that, Val, you being from Cork here in Ireland, Jeremiah is a good Cork name. So there must be, we'll be able to find, 3 dimensions of connection there, I'm sure. We don't even have to go to 6 or 7 here in this small island of ours. So firstly, a big thank you to you, Val, for reaching out to Jeremiah and inviting him to come on our little humble pod. I'm going to close out with, for me, what was one of his most profound directives. So my key takeaway here is we need to end our addiction to metrics that celebrate the absence of problems rather than the presence of understanding. So I think that links to the key messages that you mentioned there, Val. So as usual, we'll be back next month with another key topic and a mix of guest interviews. So please do subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and new episodes will miraculously find their way into their feed. Now, actually, next month we will be trying something completely new. We are going to be on the road with a live podcast event from the annual Q1 Scientific Stability Studies Conference this year on the 22nd and 23rd of October. That's based here in Ireland, and myself and Val will be there in person. Laurie will be beaming in via satellite. And we'll be covering lots of different topics with the audience on stability under pressure. So last words to you, Val, what are you sharing in the show notes this month?
Well, clearly I'll share the link to Jeremiah's blog, Investigations of a Dog. But I also think our deference to Deming, we'll repost our link to the Deming Institute. If you haven't found Deming, please do go there. Laura, you mentioned Peter Baker. He's a great blogger as well, so I'll add the link there. And finally, the link to the conference for our live performance, Nuala, at the Q1 conference. So I'll attach the link there. And Laurie, then you're doing, after that live pod, you're doing the next mystery guest.
Yes.
Any previews, any little reveals?
Yes, I can give you some previews. I won't give you a name until that day, but the preview will be, we're going to be looking at AI, particularly in the use of risk management. But this is an episode that's for everybody. We're going to start from the beginning, and we're going to talk about what is it, how does it used, what's pharma looking at, but we're going to focus a lot on quality risk management. It's very exciting.
Wow. Well, goodbye from me, Val. Looking forward to that episode.
Goodbye from Laurie.
And goodbye from Nuala.